You're listening to the 2018 Nelson Arts Festival Page and Blackmore Readers and Writers Program. This thinking brunch, Rethinking Death and Dying, features Lynda Hannah, Dr. Kiri Edge, Coroner Marcus Elliott, and memoirist Pip Desmond in conversation with Kerry Sunderland. Morena! Morena! Welcome everybody to our third thinking brunch for this year's Nelson Arts Festival. This morning we're going to be talking about death. But before we start, I'd like to say a big thank you to our sponsor, Page and Blackmore. Joe's over there. Yay. And invite you to turn your phones off or put them on silent if you haven't already done so. And we're going to have a really amazing discussion with our four panellists this morning, and I will aim to leave at least 15 minutes for questions, so that I'm sure that many of you will have questions, so that's my intention today. So another intention is to be enlightening about death rather than morbid, but I will add that we won't be mincing words. This is going to be a euphemism-free discussion, unless, of course, we're talking about why our culture relies on euphemisms, because I think that's an important conversation to have too. So I just wanted to say that if you're currently in the midst of a bereavement, and any of the discussion might trigger any of your grief, that please do what you need to do to support yourself, and it's okay if you get up and go to the bathroom or step outside or whatever. Just wanted to set that clear. So we could talk about dying for the rest of our lives, but we only have 1 hour today. So I've come up with some questions that are inspired largely from what each of our panellists have written about. So we've got 2 books we're discussing today, Death and Dying in New Zealand, a new book out from Free Range Press, which actually, this is a pre-launch event for the book because it's being launched tomorrow, I think, in Christchurch, and Song for Rosaleen by Pip Desmond. So I'm going to introduce the panellists now, and it's lucky that Lynda's on the far left because she's the first one I'm going to introduce. So Lynda Hannah established Aotearoa's first natural funeral company, which is called Living Legacies, in 2001, because she strongly believed that dying shouldn't cost the earth. She supports and empowers families who are planning and arranging low-cost, family-directed natural funerals without employing a funeral director. And Lynda's always been a bit ahead of her time. In 2002, she wrote a family funeral handbook, which was probably one of the first texts around DIY funerals and natural burials in New Zealand, if not the world. And as well as facilitating funerals, she's also a grief counsellor, celebrant, medical herbalist, naturopath, permaculture farmer, beekeeper, musician, grandmother, and a very good friend. So please welcome Lynda Hannah. Okay. Pip Desmond is a Wellington writer, editor, oral historian, and a former parliamentary press secretary. She is the author of the award-winning book Trust, a true story of women and gangs, and The War That Never Ended, New Zealand Veterans Remember Korea. Pip has an MA in creative writing and runs a communications company called To Write with her husband, Pat. Her latest book, Song for Rosaleen, is an intensely personal account of caring for her mother, but the impending global dementia epidemic gives it universal resonance. On my right, Dr. Kiri Edge is a community researcher and academic, currently based at AUT in Auckland. Kiri completed her doctoral research last year, and that involved exploring the bereavement pathways of Māori and Pākehā bicultural whānau. Kiri is currently excited about her work as a postdoctoral fellow, which is supported by Ngā Pai Otoi Maramatanga. Did I get it right? Good. Kiri herself identifies as bicultural and proudly descends from Ngāti Maniapoto and several clans on Scotland's west coast. She's also a mama to Mātai, who is 10 years old, and his badly behaved cat, Buddy. She is one of the contributors also to Death and Dying in New Zealand. I should have mentioned Lynda has contributed a chapter. And on my far right, Marcus Elliott has worked as a coroner based in Christchurch since 2015. Before that, he was a barrister at Canterbury Chambers, practising in civil litigation. He was also on the Christchurch Crown Solicitors Prosecution Panel. He was counsel assisting the Canterbury Earthquakes Royal Commission, a member of the Council of the New Zealand Bar Association, and a New Zealand Law Society Standards Committee member. And Marcus has written a fascinating chapter in Death and Dying that demystifies the role of the coroner and of the coroner's court. So can you please join me again in welcoming our panel? Thank you. Okay, so death, sex and politics. For many of us, they've been the three taboos. And I certainly remember growing up in Australia in a culture where talking about death was taboo. But I also feel that this is definitely changing, and I think the number of you here this morning are indicative of that. Death cafes, which aim to create more death-wise, death-literate communities, are happening all around New Zealand now. Nelson, Tākeka, Christchurch, Auckland, Wellington, Tauranga, Hastings and Waimate, and there's probably others that I don't know about. So I'd like to start by asking them, each of the panellists, to reflect on whether talking about death was once a taboo in your lives, and if so, what happened to change this? Because you're obviously all talking about death now. So who would like to go first? Kiri. Was talking about death once taboo in your life?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when I think about my childhood growing up, particularly with my mum's Scottish culture, was actually that, particularly for children, that it was not something, they were completely shielded from it. So that was attending funerals and that type of thing, and even witnessing any of the events and around that. So absolutely. So I wouldn't actually attend a funeral until I was probably 18. And I remember that being quite my first experience with death rituals, and obviously the death of a loved one was, it was very, very difficult. And it was not because it was something I'd not experienced before, I felt completely unprepared.
Mm. And what changed? What drew you into, researching and studying bicultural death traditions?
I think was going through adulthood and being able to see perhaps some of the differences in the way that the different sides of my family and my whānau would perhaps deal and respond to death. So the contrast between my mum and some of the Scottish ways of understanding and responding to death, and also looking at my dad's whānau, where it was a lot more perhaps embraced, if you like, and a lot more kind of commonplace. So I think that the research that I ended up conducting was really inspired from my own personal experiences of looking across my different kinship groups and
Yeah, great, thanks. And Marcus, what about you?
I think, like many people, I've probably done everything to avoid talking about death. I remember when I was young, my grandfather died, and being taken as a child into a room at the funeral director's. Sorry, my grandmother died. My grandfather's did too. And my grandfather went in and looked at the dead body and kissed the dead body, and I remember being horrified by that and wanting to get out as soon as possible. And the first time I had to think about death really was through my work, and being involved in a murder trial and seeing the autopsy, being involved as counsel assisting the Earthquake Royal Commission, where death was a spectre throughout the whole process, and then as a coroner, where it's my full-time job. But certainly I think that my experience of it has been that one tries to avoid it, one doesn't know how to deal with people affected by it, and therefore as a society we come up with euphemisms.
And there's simple ones, isn't there? Lynda, what drew you to, once was taboo, I'm sure, being brought up in the UK?
Yeah, it certainly was taboo. And my mother to this day still can't have an intelligent conversation on the subject of death. And she was utterly appalled when I launched Living Legacies. What brought me there actually was my daughter's near-death experience at the age of about 13. And I was sitting in the intensive care unit here at Nelson Hospital with her, not sure if she was going to survive. And realizing that I was totally unprepared. I had no idea about funerals. I couldn't afford a funeral. I didn't know anything about it. And thankfully she did survive. And I spent the next few weeks finding out all sorts of things about the funeral industry that I really needed to know but did not want to know. And that was a significant trigger for me when I realized where the gaps were in the funeral industry and how many people, including myself, could not afford a decent funeral for a loved one. And that was an important seed in the process of setting up Living Legacies. And another was having seen in Britain a few years earlier what was called a Green Undertakings, I think. It was a natural funeral company anyway. And I'd never heard of such a thing, and I thought that was a brilliant idea, but there was nothing like that in New Zealand. And so somebody had to start the first one, and it may as well be me.
And Pip, was you write very much about the sorts of conversations you and your siblings had while caring for your mother who had vascular dementia. Was that your first sort of kind of embracing in the subject, or had it come earlier in your life?
I think being part of a big Catholic family was actually a bonus on that score, because the Catholics didn't actually shield children from death. And when I was at college, the word would go around, there's a dead nun in the chapel. And we'd all go over to have a look. Sometimes there were two. And actually, it wasn't really till I started thinking about it that I realised that did us such a service. And when my grandmother died, I was taken to hospital to see her. My father also had a long illness. He was in his 40s when he developed epilepsy, which was actually the underlying cause was a brain tumour, and he died in his mid-60s, and that was when I really started thinking about, firsthand what death and dying. Death's just one moment. It's, there's such a big stage before that. So by the time we came to Mum, I felt like I certainly don't have any answers, but it wasn't something that was unfamiliar to me.
Mm. So part of death literacy is being able to be open and honest in dialogue with our loved ones about I think your point is very relevant, that death is just one moment. It's actually often more important to talk about the end of life, which may be years or months, or sometimes in the cases of sudden death only a moment, but what our wishes are with our family members. Can anyone share an example of where they've seen that really work well? Maybe, Lynda, you're working with a lot of families and encouraging people to think about some of these things beforehand, or is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've worked with families who have been well prepared and families who have been very poorly prepared or completely non-prepared, and the difference is huge. It's just colossal. Can I tell the story about
the family? Yeah, with it.
Okay, so I helped a family down on the west coast a few years ago who had attended one of my workshops a few months earlier, and I had not realised that one of them was dying of cancer. And so they asked me to come and be the celebrant and support them through the funeral process. And I learned that this family, the man who had died was Jewish, and his brother was there and wanted to be part of it, and his Jewish culture was important to him. The wife of the man who died was a Catholic, and she had lots of Catholic family, and she wanted, they had their own cultural expectations. And the family themselves had become Buddhists in later life. So we had to combine their Buddhist, Jewish and Catholic traditions into a funeral. And because they'd attended my workshop a few months or a year earlier, and because they'd had plenty of time to think about it, and because they were also realists, they'd worked through this whole process in a way that met everyone else's needs. So no one was left out, no one was ignored. They went out of their way to find a role for everyone in the family, and that all their cultural needs were met and expressed, and it was absolutely exquisite. It was just beautiful, and in stark contrast to families who are not prepared and find it much easier to leave out that person over there who's got a different perspective to mine, you know. Being prepared, I can't emphasize the importance of it enough. It makes such a huge difference.
Yeah, and especially in that case would have involved quite a lot of working out around what were mutually exclusive cultural traditions, like Jewish and Buddhists do not embalm generally, do they? And then Catholics, you know, have different traditions around that as well. So, yeah.
So far as I know, the only Jew who's buried in a Catholic cemetery in New Zealand.
There you go. Great. I'd like to see a show of hands, if you wouldn't mind, about who in the audience has made either an end-of-life care plan or, you know, I've sometimes called it an advanced care plan, and that might also include what's a legally binding advanced care directive. Can we have a show of hands? Oh, that's that's probably about roughly a third, I think, of the audience in our panels. What advice would does this come up in the coroner's court, Marcus, where these can be useful in, or is it just you're looking at things after the fact, so it's not so much?
Yeah, the coroner's role is very, very confined. So it's a statutory role. Our function is to determine the cause and the circumstances of certain types of death, sudden, unexpected, violent deaths. And so the only time, our most direct involvement, I suppose, is where a death, which is sudden, unexpected, violent, is reported to the coroner, and that's about 20% of all deaths. And in those cases, we have legal custody of the body between the time of the report of the death until when the body is released to the family. So certainly we'd become aware in that context of, I mean, if anything's going to highlight rifts in a family, it will be death. And so one of the things we will experience in that context is disputes about to whom should the body be released, for example, which ties in to what is going to happen to the body. But apart from that, and we don't resolve those disputes, apart from that, our function is really to look back at the cause and the circumstances. So, I couldn't comment on what happens after the body leaves the mortuary.
Yeah, fair enough. But we were talking a little earlier about with the coroner. Sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. I'll come back to that because there was something relevant that I wanted to talk about, and we'll get to it. We're just sort of moving through the process at the moment. So what I'd like to do now is to look at, there's so many big topics. We could easily spend quite a lot of time talking about any one of these, but I want to give you a little taste of each of them. So I understand now that it's sort of like roughly 60% of all people will die of frailty, of old age and diseases associated with that. And that it's one of the facts in death and dying in New Zealand, 70 to 80% of all deaths in New Zealand happen in a rest home or aged care facility, which I was quite surprised to learn. So I guess that's one of the things that could be a conversation thing with your family members around talking about that. I know that I've had my own struggles talking with my own mother about when that might be a necessary, or whether she would like that, or what other options she would. Pip, you had that experience entirely. Can you tell us a little bit about what you learnt and what you would offer as suggestions for people going into making that big decision?
I'd have to say that caring for mum with dementia totally challenged my whole idea about death, dying, and the sanctity of life, really. Because I think when we start thinking about a good life and a good death, a lot of it's about, having control and making decisions. And actually the person with dementia is not able to do that. And it's... So I suppose my first thing is, we need to talk really early. Don't think you're going to necessarily have time. You may not. My mother got dementia in her early 70s. You would have thought there would have been plenty of time to talk about her dying, but she didn't know she had dementia and she didn't acknowledge it, and those conversations actually weren't really possible after that. She did end up in care, and that was a source of enormous grief to me and my 5 siblings. And she ended up in not very good care, which we battled for many years to do the best by her that we could. I feel enormously grateful that I was so appalled by the hospital that she ended up in the last few weeks of her life that I managed to get her moved somewhere else. And she died in a place of peace and support for the family. And I'm not sure what I would say, except that it's so important. And I think that our retirement village industry and our aged care industry is not geared up to be looking after people and involving families and, you know, that dignity that we would like at the end of life. I feel I've come on with, you know, quite a sobering experience, personal experience, and I'm hoping others might be able to give a wider perspective.
Yeah. What, Kiri, from your experience in your own family and researching bicultural families, what can we learn from other cultures about going into caring for the aged and death?
I mean, I think it can come down to probably how we approach that. So there were people that contributed to my research that had particular approaches that I think really supported them. So that was in around perhaps openness, a willingness to perhaps put themselves out of their own comfort zone and maybe experience something that was unfamiliar for them. And I think that there were people that I spoke to that being able to do that for them brought them into contact with different ways of understanding, different ways of responding that really supported them, and for some people it was really transformational. So I think that being able to have a think about some of those things, particularly stepping out of our comfort zone, I think that can be really, really valuable, but also that also on the other side of that it can often require guidance and support while we're going through that as well. So I think that is, it's really possible, I think, if we're open to it, and particularly if we are respectful to other ways of understanding and responding to dying and death, and also bereavement as well.
Great. And of course the hospice service doing some pretty amazing work in many communities. But we were having an interesting conversation after yesterday's session, Pip, about sometimes very close to death, it's not even apparent to family members that their loved one has commenced the dying. So, you know, sometimes we don't even know, and you know, medical staff or whatever might not be really explicit with what's happening. So, Lynda, in your experience, have you been working with families, and when they've become more, I guess, empowered in asking questions of the medical profession and that sort of thing, where that means that those euphemisms are cast aside a little bit?
Yes, and I think it's because of the nature of the service that I offer. The people who are likely to ask questions and want to be empowered are the ones who cross my path. And those who don't want to ask questions, don't want to know, really, the ones who just go to a funeral director, ring up the one at the front of the phone book when they need it. But the people I attract and try to attract are the ones who think laterally and want to be aware of the big picture and be fully informed and present and educated on the subject, because they're realists and they know it's going to happen whether they're ready or not. So yeah, the people who cross my path are the ones who do ask the questions and demand answers from their medical professionals, and usually don't take no for an answer.
Yeah. And so before we move on from caring for people at the end of their lives, and we mentioned the statistic in yesterday's session that over the age of 80, 1 in 5 people will have some form of dementia. And then once we get to 90 and over, 1 in 2, is that right, Pip? Yeah. So that's a big case for, I think, supporting Pip's plea for us to talk about it when we're really young. And for me, my experience happened when I was in my early 40s, when my first husband died. So it's never too soon, I think, to start having conversations with our loved ones about what our wishes are as we're heading into death.
Could I put in a word here for,
Yeah,
for the
please.
lost and lonely? because a good number of the deaths that we see in the coronial context, I don't know what the statistics are, but the person who lives a reclusive life, estranged from family, chronically lonely, or perhaps not, perhaps they just like being alone, but the death is, they're found dead in bed, dead on the floor at home, body might be decomposed, mail's been building up in the postbox outside, and a neighbour smells the body, or somebody who sees that the windows get open at certain times haven't been open for weeks, and we receive the body, post-mortem's carried out, and then you release the body to no one.
And what do you think, as a culture, we might... Have you got any solutions? No, it's a big...
Yes.
No thoughts.
Well,
Yeah.
well, except to observe that, loneliness and being alone is an issue, a chronic issue in our society. How we solve it, greater minds than mine.
So you mentioned earlier that 20% of all deaths in New Zealand will end up in the coroner's court. Is that right? Did I understand that? Or they're sudden deaths? Yeah.
Yeah, the process in this country. So New Zealand has a death reporting system in which you have to identify a cause of death so that we can keep records, so we can see how people are dying. One of the most important reasons for that is so we can determine how to prevent premature death. So in about 80% of cases, a doctor, your treating doctor, can form a view about how you died based upon your health conditions, based upon the circumstances of death, and they'll sign a medical certificate, and it never comes to the coroner. The case never comes to the coroner. In some cases, the doctor doesn't feel able, and they'll refer that case to the coroner, because where the cause of death is unknown, the coroner gets involved, or the obvious ones, sudden motor vehicle accident, suicide, that sort of thing. So 20% of cases are reported, but in about 10% of those, or perhaps more, it would turn out to be a natural cause death, where the post-mortem indicates a heart disease issue. So that normally is closed at that point. So we're dealing within the 10% of sudden, unexpected, violent deaths, which may go on to a full inquiry.
And you explain in your chapter that the other role of the coroner's court is to make recommendations about avoiding some of those sudden, preventable deaths. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that role? And I think you say that that's what really has drawn you to the work.
Yeah, so the coroner's court is different to virtually every other court, apart from, say, Royal Commission, in that we're not resolving disputes between parties. We're actually inquiring into the circumstances of the death, so as to help people to understand, especially the family and society, but then also to look at ways to prevent death in similar circumstances. So the Coroner's Act says that we must consider whether we can make a comment or a recommendation to someone, the government, around consideration of a new law, for example, to prevent death in similar circumstances. And there's a whole body of coronial comments and recommendations which have built up over the years, for example, in relation to Sudi deaths. And hopefully those comments and recommendations have helped to prevent premature death.
Yeah. So I'd like to ask each of you now, and it's probably not a question you necessarily all can answer, but I put the question out there. We're all going to die, and I'm just wondering whether you think there is such a thing as a good death. And I mean, Marcus, you see a lot of the most, I guess, traumatic deaths. Do you have a sense of what a good death is, or is it?
Well, very few of the deaths I would see would be described as good deaths, because they're sudden, they're violent.
Is there such a thing?
How do I answer that? Can someone help me? I know you did give me this question to prepare for. I actually avoided it because
That's
I
okay.
really don't know.
Let's pass it on to one
yeah,
of our other panel members. Kiri, did you have any thoughts on?
I mean, as I'm sitting here thinking about it, I mean, how do you measure that, or who's measuring that in terms of what a good death is? I mean, it would come down to how you define it, but also what you're hoping for, I suppose. So, no, I'm not able to answer that that question.
I think perhaps would be better to say, what's a good life? And, particularly as our choices, diminish and change as they will as we get older. And that then sort of takes the onus off that moment of death, which I sort of struggle with this narrow focus on that. And then I think, that actually, when I think of my mum, because this is what's sort of on top for me, on one level, she stopped eating in the last 6 weeks of her life, and that was a very upsetting way for her to die at the time. But when I had a chance to process that, I actually saw that as her taking what agency she had back, and actually as a supreme act of love, both for herself and for her family, for us. So, what seemed not necessarily like a good death at the time, she died surrounded by family, and, having taken what power she could in very diminished circumstances. So, yes, it probably was a good death. Doesn't mean it wasn't hard.
And Lynda, would you like to add anything on that, Curly?
It is a tricky one. A good death for most people, I think, is one that's not too painful and not too fearful. No pain, no fear. That helps. And to know that one is loved, whether or not you're physically surrounded by friends and family, or they're just a little bit further afield, but at least to have friends and family. The loneliness that Marcus referred to is the antithesis of that, I guess. But for me, I think the main key in a good death is to have lived a good life, as you mentioned, Pip, to live while we can, to our fullest potential.
Yes, and we will come back to that again. Did you want to add something?
Well, I'll add this with some hesitation, but I think it has to be said because it's part of the discussion. I'm not expressing a view either way, and it's a topic in itself that was more than an hour. But if a good death, perhaps the discussion about whether a death is good, I think needs to involve consideration of things like empowerment as opposed to disempowerment and choice, and that leads on to a consideration of euthanasia.
Yes, yeah. So actually having a conversation around that beforehand. Do you mean?
I think so. That the issue of what is a good death and what might involve is tied in with a discussion around the availability or not, and one's views about.
Yeah. Which is something that I understand is one of the topics that a lot of death cafes do discuss, and obviously there's legal reviews in New Zealand, and actually that leads into my next question, because it's all very well for us to be able to discuss with our loved ones what we want, and to have certain wishes about what we want to happen at the end of our life and with our body and that sort of thing. But at the moment, I think you pointed out just before the session started that the law does currently not recognise those wishes in any way. So if you put them in your will or even in an advanced healthcare plan, there's no obligation. And there's been a review over the last few years. I think you made a submission to it with the Law Commission review of the Burial and Cremation Act. And as far as I could tell in my research for this session, there hasn't really been any kind of outcome yet from that review. Could you add to that?
Yeah, so many of you will have heard of the Takamore case, which went to the Supreme Court, and in which the Supreme Court set out some laws relating to the powers and the rights of decision-making around a dead body. But the legal position is that currently is that if you express a wish, it's not legally enforceable, and the executor can step in and make decisions subject to certain criteria. And the Law Commission looked into all of this and made a series of recommendations about amending the Burial and Cremation Act, which is an act which is 50 years old and which itself was based upon antecedents going back to the 19th century, and which is silent on the question of, how should the process take place around decision making of burial or cremation or other way of dealing with the body. So the Commission made a series of recommendations, one of which, for example, was that the wishes of the deceased, and I'll just find the words here, they must be given effect unless there is a compelling reason not to. For example, if you say, I want my body to be taken to outer space and ejected into the rings of Mercury, then you could probably say, no, that's not reasonable. So that's, and there are a series of other recommendations as well. But as far as I can see, the previous government responded by saying, we appreciate it and we're looking into it. I think they said there's more policy and consultation work required on the burial and cremation amendments, but I think that's where it currently sits.
Lynda, you made a submission to that review, didn't you? Yeah. What was the sort of key things that you were arguing for change?
One of them was for the opening up of burial alternatives, because since 1964, when the Burials and Cremations Act was written or whatever, there's been no provision for private burial grounds. And that means that all the natural burial grounds that are opening up around New Zealand now are only able to be part of an already existing designated burial ground or a cemetery, which is why the one we have two in Nelson, one in Motueka, one in Tākeka now, and they're all sort of along the edge of an existing cemetery. And there's more and more interest in having options, basically. And I had a Winston Churchill Memorial Fellowship trip to Britain about 10, 12 years ago, where there was hundreds of different options that local farmers could set aside an acre of land on their own farm for natural burials, and charities and churches and businesses and funeral directors, and there were all sorts of options and possibilities, which was really exciting. Here, the options are very limited. So that was the main thrust of my submission, but there were other aspects in there as well, which this probably isn't the time to go into all the details.
Yep, and I think your chapter very eloquently looks at that, desire for us to have options, and they're very, the numerous options that are involved.
And more environmentally responsible options as well.
Which segues beautifully to my next point or question, was around embalming in New Zealand, because I was shocked. I come from Australia, where embalming is not very common, and to learn that 90%, it was another stat in the book, 90% of bodies in New Zealand are currently embalmed, was the figure quoted, and I think it's a reasonably recent one. But then I understood, after reading more about the tangi tradition, that often Kei Paku's chapter in the book about the tangi. So I wanted to lead into asking you to tell us a little bit about what you learnt. I mean, I feel a real sense that here in New Zealand, people are more open to being with the body after a death than certainly they were where I grew up in Australia. And obviously that's very much from the Māori tradition of the tangi. Kiri, can you tell us a little bit about what you could say biculturally, what Pākehā could learn from Māori about that tradition, which is your whole research thesis.
So I think, one of the things within Antony Hana is, and some people may be aware of it, is that there is a constant and collective vigil that is observed in around the tūpapaku or the deceased body. So that, I think, does a few things. So one, it reflects a very spiritual belief that the wairua or the spirit of the deceased person is still lingering, and that it needs support to sort of move on to the next realm. But I also think that the other thing that it does is it is a very intimate, raw and real way of supporting the bereaved to know and accept that their loved one has actually died. And I think when I think about my own experiences as coming from a bicultural whānau, is being able to, I know at my grandfather's funeral that he wanted to be in a closed coffin, and that was very much respected, and I understood it. But for me, having attended Antony Hana, where I had been able to spend time with my deceased loved ones, to sit alongside them, to grieve and to mourn over them and that type of thing. So whereas at my grandfather's funeral, I was sort of really detached from any kind of raw and real kind of proof that he had actually died. On one level I knew that he had, but I think that for me, it didn't, it sort of prolonged my grief process, I think, in some ways. So I was really divorced from that very real sense that he had gone. I mean, it's very difficult and it's very confronting, but I also think that it's one of those critical moments in life that the only way through it is through the eye of the storm, I think, and that's, yeah.
And expressing rather than repressing what those emotions are.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the high percentage of embalming in New Zealand may or may not be related to the tradition of being with the body for 3 days. But there are alternatives, aren't there, Lynda? It's not necessary that we embalm a body if we want to bring it home for a number of days. And yeah.
Embalming is legally required in the presence of an infectious disease. Even though in reality it's that even that rule is redundant, but that's the rule that exists at this point in time. But there are much better ways to preserve a body, or rather to slow down the decomposition. You can't preserve a body permanently. I suppose you could encase it in resin, but I don't recommend that. But we use ice packs. I used to use dry ice, but I found that a bit more complicated, and now it's just ordinary party ice from the supermarket or the petrol station in little bags stacked around the body, and it keeps the body cold enough. And you need to keep the body dry, and it just works. It's actually a very simple process, much more simple than some funeral directors would have us believe.
And can you add what you think the benefit is for a family or loved ones of actually spending time with the body after?
Oh, it's huge. It's really, really important. To fully, tangibly understand that this person is actually dead. Not just sleeping, not just whatever, but really dead and not coming back. And over the space of a few days, the body there in the family home, that becomes an unarguable fact. And the individual family members have the support of all the rest of the family to accept that fact. And everyone gets to deal with it, to recognize it, to have a role in changing the ice when it melts, for example, or helping to dress someone, or lifting them into the coffin, or helping with the paperwork, or writing a eulogy, or whatever else. There is a hands-on role for everyone in the family, and that whole process really binds the family together, connects them into a very cohesive group that supports each other, that supports themselves, each other, for a long time after the death, which is an entirely different way of doing it than just sending the body away to a funeral home and turning up a few days later and like watching it all go by on a TV screen almost. The family's there in the home doing what needs to be done, and they grieve much better in a really healthy way.
Of course, there are different cultural traditions and religious traditions that, for the example, mean that people don't have that much time, that, you know, that cremation might happen sooner after death and that sort of thing. I understand in Catholicism that an open casket was once, and probably still is, very common. I mean, so that's something that's very different to my upbringing of not even, you know, seeing my grandfather. And you might have been the same after he died. I'm interested in the question around, again, how society has changed in the last maybe 50 years or so, where the funeral industry has become much more involved, and we're also living in a much more post-religious world. So there's not as much, you know, prescription for what we do, and how that impacts on the sort of ceremonies and rituals that we might have after death. And if, you know, and in many ways, sometimes it's a blank canvas. It's an opportunity to create new rituals and experiences. So what are some of the things that you've seen in your work, Lynda, that with that blank canvas that people have been able to do that has been really helpful to those left behind?
It's great when they realise that there is a blank canvas, because most people don't. But it's liberating to recognise that fact. And I often get asked strange questions, or questions that seem to me to be strange, like, should the coffin go in feet first or head first? And I say, if it doesn't matter to you, it doesn't matter to me. If they have their religious or cultural or spiritual expectations that the body should go in feet first or head first, then it matters to them, and they would know what that rule is, and they will do it that way. But if they don't know that, then it really doesn't matter. And it's not for me to prescribe to them which way round the coffin goes or how they should do things if they don't already, if those cultural expectations don't matter to them, then they just don't matter.
Mm. And how's the Antony Hana traditions, have they changed and adapted recently, or are they still very traditional that have been handed down for generations in terms of
I mean, I think that
ceremony?
there's elements of Antony Hana that probably mirror some of the more traditional forms that Antony Hana has changed. But I think it's like any culture, it changes and it evolves. And I think, you know, as society or as our peoples change and evolve, then our rituals and that type of thing need to follow within that. One of the things about Antony Hana that I particularly like is what they call the pora Archy, which is the night before burial. So we have a very, you know, a lot of the other rituals and practices in around Antony Hana are quite formal and they are quite prescribed. Whereas the pora Archy is a really, it's the night before the funeral. It's a really informal space. It's an opportunity for anyone to get up and share stories and share memories and song. And I think that you have a real range of emotions that happen on that final night. So that's laughter and tears. And the other thing, and I think my first experience with the pora Archy, I was quite taken back by it, but you have very open and very honest and sometimes quite brutal recalling of the deceased. And I think that that's really important, because for me, you walk away with a better understanding, a shared understanding of your deceased loved one. And I think that helps you does help you to understand them better, but I also think it helps you to remember them better as well. Mm.
Great. Now it is 1:45, so I am going to open up for questions. If one of our wonderful ushers wouldn't mind grabbing the radio mic. Valerie or Marion, thank you. And I do have some more questions, so we'll come back together for the final questions from me. But would anyone in the audience there's a question down here in the front. We'll just bring you the microphone because we are recording this for a podcast, so we want to get the question on. Yeah, it's just here. Thank you.
Hello. My question concerns what happens if you wish to donate your body to science. It occurred to me that might be quite a cheap option.
Yep. Yep.
Do you know? I know a little bit.
I can answer that.
I don't know how cheap it is. Well, you can express that wish. I think like any wish that you express, it isn't legally enforceable. My brief experience with this issue in the context of a duty coroner is that there's actually I was going to say quality threshold. Let's say there's some criteria. But then, you know, subject to what we've discussed around the decision-making about what becomes of your body, then your wishes may well be observed, and you'll have to Google the cost.
I can tell you that it is a cheap option, but not everyone is eligible, and it depends on the circumstances, and you do have to organise it before you die, and in conjunction with your family and friends, you know, next of kin, and there's no guarantee that it will happen the way you want it to, but it won't happen at all if you don't organise it beforehand.
And it's my understanding also that it's based on where you live too, whether it's feasible or not. So you need to be close to where there's someone, you know, a school like down in Otago, I believe, in the South Island is probably the only place.
And
that will accept, and in Auckland, yeah. Okay, there's another question sort of in the middle towards the back there, yeah.
I'd like to comment on the previous question. I just got an email from Greenpeace where one of their major... Here? Is that better? Okay, I just got an email from Greenpeace because one of their active members died and did something different, and this was organ donation, which I had never considered, because when I looked into donating my body for University, Otago University Medical School, I found out I was too old. But anyway, this organ donation is very interesting. So it's the Greenpeace site, and they led me to the whole process. And it turned out this lady's lungs is now being used by somebody. And the skin of people is often helpful. And it said quite specifically age was irrelevant. It was a question of whether the organs, and but in any case, that is a lead-in. And it is a different option, which I'd never thought of. And I immediately emailed my daughters and said, is that all right? Because that seemed like a good option for me. But I'd also like to speak on quite a different thing. And I'm an ecologist, and I'm interested in death for a number of reasons. One of them being that my husband of 57 years died just in April, and we had a natural burial. And I was so happy to have that option. And you just go to choice, or you go to Lynda. And we didn't use ice. I didn't have a funeral director. I had a funeral guide. And she, fortunately, knew what to do, had all the equipment. We didn't use ice because she had a cooling blanket. So my husband was at home in the study where he has spent a lot of his life. And the cardboard coffin was in the lounge for people to write and send messages or make drawings. And it was a wonderful experience. And I'm so grateful that that was an option. Now, the other thing is that professionally yeah, I know. I have a comment that I feel quite strongly about. I just wanted to say that this natural burial thing is just a marvelous option, and it's very recent. And the first on the South Island was in Motueka. Is that as an ecologist, where I realize death is something you're not supposed to talk about, but life totally depends on death. We could not have life on Earth unless we have death. And once you realize that, at least for me, it made a big difference. So people can comment on the ecological aspects, because both cremation and embalming are environmentally very bad choices.
You're so right, and there's the three benefits really. There's the cost savings, there's the empowering the family members, and there's also the benefit to our planet. So that's very true. Do we have any other questions? And I would encourage you to ask a question if you can. With the microphones just coming. There will be an opportunity for everybody to come and chat to our panellists afterwards if you'd like to share your own stories, but questions
Just,
now.
about conversation, I've tried to talk about this with my children who are in their 20s, and I'm just shut down. And the only time they're awake to it is we had a family member die, and I had all this instruction about being safe, you know, because they were like, this person unexpectedly died. What advice do you have about talking with children, whatever age, to begin the conversation, and how do you continue to come back to it so they're not afraid, you know, just...
Pip, did you were nodding, so I think
I
you had
am
some
nodding
thoughts.
because I think this, you know, knowing that I was on this panel, really, you know, I started to have a conversation. I'm having trouble talking to my husband. He thinks I'm, you know, the first sign of the flu, and I'm going to have him, you know, out the door. So, and I and my 30-year-old son who's just got a new baby, and you know he doesn't want to talk about his mother dying. I don't know. I think it's a really interesting question, and I suspect it's a bit like a dripping tap, and we just start doing it until it stops being this terrible thing that either don't you like being here, or don't you want me to be here? It's part of the dripping tap, I think, for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Lynda, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say persist. I've talked with very elderly people who say, I really like this idea of natural funerals, but my daughter would never agree to it. And I've talked with the younger generation, her daughter's generation, which is mainly my generation, who say, I really like this idea, but my mother wouldn't want it. And they don't talk to each other, and so just talk. Whether they want to listen or not, just talk. Buy a copy of the book. I say to people, buy a copy of my book, leave it on the coffee table, and they'll pick it up and flip through it. Write the letter anyway. Write out your funeral wishes and send it to them. Whether or not they want to read it, at least it's clear. Just keep dripping.
Yep. Yes, thank you. And there's one up the back too after.
My question is for Lynda. Hi, I'm Maralina. I'm a fellow funeral celebrant. We've talked a lot about the elderly death and dying. What about the other end? Stillbirth, cot death, palliative care, children, where that is obviously incredible time. What can you offer, suggest at those death or the dying process in young children?
Oh, it's certainly difficult, a lot more difficult. It really is. I had one woman came along to my workshop several years ago with a newborn baby, and she was there because the baby had a diagnosis of something, I can't remember what, but was unlikely to live for a year. And she was prepared. She was preparing herself for how to deal with the loss of this child. And it just takes a huge amount of courage. I mean, basically it's the same. The actual process is the same as it is for your 97-year-old grandmother, or as it is for a 45-year-old meat worker, whatever. The process is the same, but the level of loss, I suppose, varies considerably. When somebody's 97, they've lived a good life, people are celebrating largely at their funeral as much as they are mourning. With a small child, it's a completely different ball game.
Celebrate a life that
hasn't been lived. That's right. Yeah, and I think, to be honest, just be honest. Let's be real about that.
There's a question right up the back, against the back wall. Yep, Phillida, thanks. And while the microphone's on its way, I just thought I'd add to that dilemma of discussing with parents or children about death is that I've found I'm really a big fan of the mushroom suit, I must say, which is a natural burial thing that you can actually order a mushroom suit and be buried in it, and it will not only basically compost your body, but detoxify you before you go into the earth. So I tell my mum all about that, and I've found that by sharing with my mum what I want, she starts to open up a little bit more. And also being super curious, rather than jumping to the fears and everything, but just be curious and ask lots of questions. So, Phillida, yes, your question.
How can we encourage the honesty of the Archy into Pākehā practices? We had a difficult, stroppy, wonderful woman die in our women's group, and so we had the coffin open, and we had a negative round, and we really let her have it. Told her how tough it had been to be a friend, and then we had a positive round, and we were able to take the memory of that person in a very shared positive way forward. And ever since then, I've hated how we rush over the negative. Nobody's allowed to talk to it. We all have to go into these very positive memories, and they never seem quite real to us after that. So how can we link into the things that you're saying about resolution and community through the Archy?
I mean, I think sometimes for starters, it's in around creating spaces and places to be able to do that. And so that can be physical spaces as well. So, you know, if you've got, you know, mum or dad that's passed away, you're all in the lounge, you're all around, and then, you know, someone might start up, there might be some humour in around that. But it also depends on who's in the room and the relationships and that type of thing. And I think you still have to have a certain amount of trust and rapport and perhaps understanding. If someone's to get up and say, actually, Dad could be a real bastard. You know, if people aren't prepared for that or used to that, then that might be quite difficult for them. But I think it's just, I think humour is, and even when we're, you know, we're having difficulties and encouraging our family members to talk in around that type of thing, I think a little bit of humour can be a really good sort of lubricant, if you like, in terms of sort of brokering that and making people a little bit more comfortable in around it. So, yeah. I think it is quite difficult if you're not used to it, but I think, you know, in terms of your experience and what you're all able to walk away from, I think if there's an understanding of that and you're all joining and sharing together, then I think it can be, you know, you can create something quite beautiful and very therapeutic alongside that too.
Right. That's a great answer, thank you. And we are almost out of time, so I'd like to ask a final question. And it's about living well. So, I mean, for me, I think talking about death hasn't been morbid, and it certainly, I mean, I think a lot of people carry the fear that talking about it might make it happen faster, but that's been scientifically disproven. And in contrast, thinking about death has made me feel much more electrifyingly alive. And so I'd like to just ask each of the panellists to share what death has taught them about living life well. What has it thrown into sharp relief about how you want to live your life? Marcus, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm thinking of death as the permanent absence of oneself, which is really hard to contemplate, isn't it? But in my role as a coroner, I have the privilege and the responsibility of seeing a lot of things about people that are quite very private. So we see photographs of their dead body. We see the body stripped of clothing in the mortuary. We see text data, medical records, statements from friends. We might read a suicide note. So, and the circumstances of death can tell you a lot about the person's life as well. So I suppose I've really learned that although, you know, depending on the individual, you might be connected to other people, you might tell people certain things or not. Death is that point of ultimate sort of separation, and so because of that, and because we're so complex, because we have so much going on, I just remember that it's we've got to keep in mind that the person who's angry might really be scared, or the person who's cruel might really be lonely, and when in a world that's easy to jump to judgment about people and be critical and so on, just the importance of kindness and the importance of compassion to each other.
Thank you.
I guess in terms of my own, you know, my own personal experiences and the research that I was involved in as well, I think thinking about death, what it has really sort of emphasised for me is that, you know, there's only one way that grief comes into our lives, and that is through love, relationships and connections. And I actually think, and I certainly agree with what Marcus has said, when we think about, you know, some of the ideals and values in around relationships like respect and compassion, I think that those are things that can help to carry us through that bereavement. But I think we also, those are the things that we want to, what we want to hold on to. We may, you know, the tears that we shed in that immediate bereavement, they may still come, but I think it's also thinking about really holding on to and celebrating those things. It's the love and it's the affection, the memories, the connections and the relationships. So it's quite obviously a very heavy topic, and that was one of the things that I really held on to during that time, which I think is something to it's quite light, it's quite affirming, and it's quite life affirming too. So I think that, obviously when we're upset and we're mourning, it can be quite easy to lose sight of that. But I think that that's probably one of the key take-home messages that I took from my work and my research. Yes. Mm.
Well, when I think of my mum, there's a couple of things that come up, and one is that, I sort of see, she was dying really from the time she got dementia. Well, we're all dying. We're dying since we were born. But for her, dementia stripped away so much, but what it did leave was a sort of an absolute clamouring for connection, and that I think has stayed with me, that we might think we're, invincible, independent, want to carve our own path, but as soon as the chips are down, actually what's really, really important is our families and our friends and our relationships. And probably the other thing I think is that, and I said this yesterday, what I learned too was the importance of not sort of suppressing our emotions, and that's around death, as we've been talking today, but actually around life even more, because I saw that had a huge effect on Mum, and one of the positive things about dementia was it actually uncovered some of her emotions, which was both challenging and life-affirming.
For me, it's about love. People say to me sometimes, how can you stand to be around people who are sad all the time? And I say that what I see most of the time at funerals is not just the sadness, but the love. If there was no love, there would be no sadness, and grief is the price that we pay for love. I see more love at a funeral than I do at a wedding. It's true. And so I have a favourite verse from an Indigo Girls song. It's a chorus, actually. I'll tell it to you. It goes, the most important bit is the first line. So we must love, while these moments are still called today. Take part in the pain of this passion play, stretching our youth as we must, until we are ashes to dust, until time makes history of us. I think that's beautiful.
And what a lovely note to end on. I'd encourage you to continue the conversation now with your neighbours here in the audience, with your families and friends. And there is a Death Cafe coming up next weekend at the Nelson Library, Elmer Turner Library, from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. So if you're interested in that, I see Kirsten up the back there. You can go and ask her about it. So please join me in thanking Lynda Hannah, Pip Desmond, Kiri Pihangawang, and Marcus Elliott. So did I get your surname? Kiri Edge.